In the misty, blood-soaked glens of 13th-century Ireland, survival was not bought with silver, but with cold, unforgiving steel. Imagine staring across a bog at an armored giant, draped in heavy chainmail, hefting a massive double-headed axe, capable of cleaving a mounted knight and his horse in half with a single devastating blow. These were the Galloglass. Originating from the wind-whipped coasts of western Scotland, these fearsome mercenaries became the ultimate weapon in medieval Ireland's bloody power struggles. For over 300 years, from the 13th to the 16th centuries, Ireland was a brutal chessboard of warring clans, local chieftains, and encroaching English armies. Light skirmishers and guerrilla tactics ruled the land, but when heavily armored Anglo-Norman knights arrived in 1169, traditional Irish forces were slaughtered. Facing total annihilation, the desperate Irish lords looked across the sea for salvation. They imported a new breed of warrior, an elite, highly violent class of professional killers who transformed the face of Irish warfare forever. Who were these elite axemen that could stop the English juggernaut in its tracks? How did they rise to dominate an island for 3 centuries? And what happens when the ultimate medieval super-soldier meets the dawn of gunpowder? The year 1166 marked the beginning of Ireland's descent into a generational nightmare. Dermot MacMurrough, the deposed king of Leinster, made a fatal decision. To reclaim his throne from High King Rory O'Conor, he sold his soul to the English crown. In exchange for loyalty to King Henry II, MacMurrough imported heavily armored Anglo-Norman mercenaries. But this wasn't just a tactical reinforcement, it was an open door to a relentless invasion. By October 1171, King Henry himself landed with a royal army to seize control of the entire island, triggering a brutal war of conquest. The native Irish forces were dangerously outmatched. Gaelic lords traditionally relied on light infantry, the so-called kern, and light cavalry. These troops were perfect for the cattle raids, ambushes, and guerrilla warfare native to Ireland's bogs and forests, but they were utterly useless against the shock tactics of Norman men-at-arms. Norman knights, trained from youth to fight on foot or horseback with lance and heavy swords, carved through the unarmored kern like a scythe through wheat. The Irish faced absolute slaughter in open battle. Desperate for a countermeasure, the lords looked to the Inzigal, the Isles of the Foreigners along Scotland's rugged western coast. This melting pot of Norse and Celtic heritage bred warriors hardened by freezing seas and ceaseless clan warfare. These men, soon known as the Galloglass, were natural-born killers, combining Viking ferocity with Gaelic tenacity. By the mid-13th century, the first recorded Galloglass had arrived in Ulster, offering their legendary axes to the highest bidder. Their arrival didn't just tip the scales, it shattered them. But as the conflict fractured Ireland between native dynasties and Anglo-Irish lords, the Galloglass were not just brutes, they were highly specialized heavy infantry. Their standard unit, the Carraguth battle, consisted of roughly 80 to 100 elite axemen. But a Galloglass never fought alone. Each warrior was accompanied by 2 unarmored assistants, a squire to carry their heavy armor and weapons, and a page who acted as a skirmisher with darts and short bows. A full Carraguth totaled nearly 300 men. This support system allowed the Galloglass to conserve their explosive energy until the exact moment of impact. Their strategy on the battlefield was anchored in the defensive powerhouse known as the Castle of Bones. When under fire or facing a cavalry charge, the Galloglass would pack into a dense, shield-locked formation at the center of the Irish line. From this impregnable human fortress, lighter Irish troops could dart out to harass the enemy with javelins and arrows, retreating to the safety of the axemen when threatened. Offensively, they were terrifying shock troops. Once the squires softened the enemy lines, the heavily armored Galloglass would charge forward. With mail coats gleaming and 6-foot spar axes raised high, they struck with enough kinetic force to shatter English shield walls and drag knights from their saddles. To maintain this supreme combat standard, the Galloglass evolved into a hereditary warrior caste. They were real military families, fathers rigorously trained sons, passing down centuries-old martial techniques. Constables, their commanders, were awarded land and estates by Gaelic lords, integrating them deeply into the feudal hierarchy. By 1400, a lord without a Galloglass contingent was a dead man walking. To feed the skyrocketing demand, local Irish recruits were trained to fill the lower ranks, creating an island-wide network of mercenary clans loyal only to the highest bidder. It is August 19, 1504. The stage is set at Knockdoe, the Hill of the Axes, located just 13 kilometers outside of Galway. It is the greatest clash of Galloglass in history. Gerald Fitzgerald, the Earl of Kildare and the English King's deputy, has assembled an army of 6,000 men. The bulk of his force consists of battle-hardened Galloglass, summoned to crush his ambitious brother-in-law, Ulick Burke. Burke and his allies command a rival force of 4,000 men, similarly reliant on these fearsome heavy infantrymen. This is no mere border skirmish, it is a showdown of titans, a brutal culmination of generations of mercenary warfare, where professional loyalty trumps bloodlines. At the break of dawn, the morning mist clears to reveal the opposing armies. Without a moment of hesitation, Burke's Galloglass ignite the conflict. They charge up the steep slope of Knockdoe, their chainmail rattling and their massive axes glinting in the pale sunlight. Kildare's archers unleash a devastating hail of arrows, blackening the sky, but the Galloglass absorb the deadly shower. Arrows glance off their bassinet helmets and heavy mail as the axemen maintain their terrifying momentum. The ground shakes as the two walls of heavy infantry collide with the deafening crash of steel on steel. The combat is intensely claustrophobic. Men are packed shoulder to shoulder, hacking and slashing with devastating power. The Galloglass swing their 6-foot spar axes with mechanical precision, aiming to crush bones through armor and shatter the wooden shafts of their enemies' weapons. Blood quickly soaks the grassy hillside, turning the earth into a treacherous, muddy slaughterhouse. For hours, the battle hangs in the balance, an exhausting test of endurance and pure physical strength. Slowly, the sheer numerical superiority of Kildare's 6,000 troops begins to suffocate Burke's outnumbered force. Kildare's men expertly envelop the flanks of the attackers, pushing up the hill, squeezing them into a fatal pocket. Realizing their impending annihilation, Burke's battered forces finally break and attempt a desperate retreat toward the Clare River. As the surviving Galloglass conduct a brutal rearguard action to cover their fleeing comrades, history pivots. Amidst the chaos of the pursuit, a single sharp crack cuts through the din of melee combat. A fleeing Galloglass has his brain matter scattered, not by a traditional axe, but the heavy iron barrel of a primitive handgun.
the greatest nemesis of medieval armor has finally and officially arrived on the bloody battlefield.
The slaughter at Knockdoe marked a turning point, not just for the feuding lords of Ireland, but for the Galloglass themselves. That single brutal crack of the handgun signaled the end of an era. In the 16th century, the Galloglass experienced a final, violent boom. English-born administrators, desperate to subject rebellious Irish and Anglo-Irish lords to the Tudor crown, heavily employed these mercenaries. But the very technology that killed that warrior at Knockdoe was rapidly evolving. Across Europe, the nature of warfare was undergoing a massive revolution. The age of the individual heroic heavy infantryman was fading, replaced by the grim realities of pike and shot. The extraordinary, lifelong training and personal strength required to wield a Galloglass axe were becoming obsolete. Queen Elizabeth I's armies were vast, conscripted forces drilled to fight in massive, brutally mechanical pike formations, supported by legions of musketeers. Against disciplined ranks of gunpowder weapons that could pierce heavy chainmail from 100 yards away, the gallantry of a charging axeman was suicidal. Furthermore, the Galloglass simply could not supply the thousands of recruits needed to compete with the sheer scale of the new English war machine. The castle of bones that had dominated the Irish battlefield for 300 years crumbled before the unfeeling logic of gunpowder. Once the supreme apex predators of medieval combat, the Galloglass ultimately dissolved. Many fled the country, joining the famous wild geese mercenaries in Catholic European armies, leaving behind a permanent legacy carved in blood and cold steel. The story of the Galloglass is more than just a bloody chapter in military history. It is a masterclass in adaptation and obsolescence. These Scottish exiles capitalized on a critical vulnerability in the Irish defense network, evolving from rootless mercenaries into the island's most formidable warrior elite. They adapted to their environment, mastering the brutal realities of Gaelic warfare to become the ultimate shock troops. Yet their downfall reminds us of a fundamental truth in military evolution. Hyper-specialization can be a fatal trap. The Galloglass perfected a very specific style of warfare: heavy armor, immense physical strength, and close-quarters dominance. But when the rules of the game changed with the advent of gunpowder, their centuries of tradition became their greatest weakness. They could not adapt to a world that valued mass conscription and firepower over individual martial prowess. What about you? Do you think the Galloglass could have adapted their tactics to survive the gunpowder era? Or were they doomed by their own traditions? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive into the bloody history of Ireland's axemen, hit that subscribe button for more under-the-radar military history. Next time, we're heading to the scorching sands of the Middle East to uncover the psychological warfare of the Hashashin, the original order of assassins. Stay tuned.